There is a word at the very beginning of Hebrews 11 that most readers pass over without stopping. The translators give it as substance in the King James and assurance in the ESV, but neither word carries the full weight of what the author actually wrote. The Greek is hypostasis, and outside the New Testament it appears in papyrus receipts, property deeds, and inheritance contracts from the ancient world. When someone purchased a piece of land in 1st century Egypt, they did not carry the land around with them. They carried the hypostasis, the document that proved the land belonged to them. It was not the thing itself, but it functioned as the thing. It had the same legal force. The person holding that piece of papyrus could stand in court and say, "This field is mine, even though I have never touched the soil." The document was the ownership. That is the word the author of Hebrews chooses to describe faith. And that changes the sentence entirely. The verse is not saying that faith is a feeling of certainty about things hoped for. It is saying that faith is the legal document that makes the unseen thing a present possession. The person who believes does not merely wait for the future. They hold the deed to it now. This is not a poetic metaphor. It is a forensic claim. The author is using the vocabulary of the courts and the marketplace to say something precise about what faith actually is. The problem is that we have spiritualized the word until it lost its teeth. Most modern readers hear faith is the assurance of things hoped for, and they think about confidence, optimism, a positive mental state. But the word hypostasis does not refer to a state of mind. It refers to a legal standing. It refers to something objective that exists outside the believer, a document, a title, a guarantee that has been deposited and cannot be revoked. Faith is not the feeling that God will come through. Faith is the receipt for what God has already given, even before it arrives. This is not an easy shift to make. It requires the reader to stop thinking of faith as something they produce and start thinking of it as something they hold. And that distinction matters because it changes the entire structure of the Christian life. If faith is a feeling, then the person who feels weak does not have it. But if faith is a legal document, then the strength of the holder does not affect the validity of the document. A child can hold a land deed. A sick person can hold a land deed. A person in the middle of a panic attack can hold a land deed. The paper does not depend on the grip. It depends on the one who signed it. The author of Hebrews knows this. He has spent the previous 10 chapters building an argument about who signs the document. He has shown that Jesus is the guarantor of a better covenant, the mediator who enters the inner sanctuary once for all, the high priest who sits at the right hand of the majesty on high. Every term in those chapters, guarantee, mediator, sanctuary, covenant, belongs to the same legal and liturgical world as hypostasis. The author is not switching genres when he reaches chapter 11. He is making the same argument from a different angle. The faith that justifies is the faith that receives the document, and the document is the promise itself, made tangible by the one who cannot lie. But there is a tension here that the text does not resolve easily. If faith is the title deed to what is not seen, then what happens when the thing promised does not materialize in the expected time frame? The chapter that follows is a gallery of people who died without receiving what was promised. Abel was killed. Noah spent decades building a boat before the rain came. Abraham left his country and died as a foreigner in the land he was promised. They all held the deed. They all died before the deed was executed. That is the same tension. Every believer faces. The document is real, but the delivery is delayed. The author does not explain why. He simply lists the names and lets the reader sit with the gap between the promise and the fulfillment. And that is exactly where the present-day reader lives. Not in a world where every prayer is answered before the prayer is finished, but in a world where the document sits in a drawer and the field remains empty. The person who has prayed for healing and still carries the illness. The person who has trusted God for provision and still counts the coins. The person who believes in the resurrection and still stands at a graveside. All of them hold hypostasis. The question is whether they know that the document is enough. The author of Hebrews is not offering a theology of positive thinking. He is offering a theology of legal standing. The person who has faith has been given something that cannot be taken away and has not yet been fully delivered. That is the shape of the Christian life between the ascension and the return. It is a life lived in the tension of holding the deed while the ground is still fallow. And the temptation, always, is to confuse the delay with the failure of the document. That temptation has been present since the first generation of the church, and it is present in every person who reads this chapter and wonders if their faith is strong enough to count. The word hypostasis answers that question before it is fully asked. It was never about the strength of the holder. It was always about the validity of the document. And the document does not expire. It does not weaken. It does not require the holder to feel anything about it. It simply exists as a legal fact, which means the real question the passage asks is not whether you trust God enough. The real question is whether you have understood that the trust is a response to a transaction that has already taken place. The title deed exists because the purchase was made. The purchase was made because the price was paid. And the price was paid before you were born, before you had faith, before you could even understand the concept of a promise. The faith that holds the deed is simply the acknowledgement that the transaction is complete. It does not add anything to the transaction. It receives what was already accomplished. That is a hard thing to internalize, because every instinct in the human heart wants to contribute. The person who holds a deed to a house did not build the house. They received the right to it. But the person who is accustomed to earning feels the need to earn even the receipt. The author of Hebrews is pulling that impulse out by the root. He is saying that faith is not the work that earns the reward. Faith is the hand that receives the document, and the hand can be empty and trembling. It does not matter. The document is still the document. The chapter opens with this word, because the chapter is going to spend the rest of its length proving exactly this point. Every figure in the list, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, received the promise in the form of a document. None of them received it in the form of full possession. That is not an accident. That is the premise of the entire argument. And the author does not apologize for it. He does not soften it. He names the people who held the deed and died without seeing the deed fully executed, and he calls their lives the greatest testimony to what faith actually is. The viewer sitting with this passage has to decide whether that is encouraging or discouraging. Most sermons try to make it encouraging by emphasizing the reward that is coming, but the text itself does not do that. The text simply presents the legal reality and moves on. The encouragement is not in the delay. The encouragement is in the document. The document is not a promise that things will get better tomorrow. The document is a claim that things have already been settled in a court that does not make mistakes. And that is where the tension must sit for now. The word hypostasis has been uncovered. The legal background has been laid. But the full force of what that means for the specific figures in the chapter and for the person who reads their stories has not yet been pressed. The chapter moves from the definition to the list, and the list does not explain itself. It simply names the names. The explanation is hidden in the gap between what they held and what they saw, and that gap is where the reader lives. The gap between what they held and what they saw is not a flaw in the argument. It is the argument. The entire chapter is built around the premise that the document is real and the delivery is postponed, and that postponement is not a defect but a design. The author names Abel, who offered a better sacrifice and was killed for it, and the text says that through his faith he still speaks even though he is dead. The document outlasted the bearer. Enoch was taken so that he did not see death, and before his translation he was commended as having pleased God. The document was executed for him before the normal term. But then the list moves to Noah, who built an ark for a flood he had never seen, and to Abraham, who left his country without knowing where he was going, and to Sarah, who conceived when the time of the promise had already passed biologically. Every one of them operated on the basis of a document that had not yet been cashed, and the author says flatly that none of them received what was promised. They saw it from a distance, they welcomed it, and they died. That is the sentence that most modern preaching skips or softens. It does not fit the success-oriented theology that wants faith to produce results in this lifetime. But the author does not flinch. He says they acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They did not receive the things promised. And then he adds a detail that changes everything. They desired a better country, a heavenly one. And God is not ashamed to be called their God because he has prepared a city for them. The document was not a deed to real estate in Canaan. It was a deed to a city whose builder and maker is God. The promise was always larger than the land. The land was a down payment, but the full inheritance was something else entirely. And the figures in the chapter understood that. They held a document that pointed beyond the visible plane, and they were willing to die without seeing the full execution because they trusted the one who signed it. This is where the second legal term in verse 1 becomes significant. The author writes not only that faith is the hypostasis of things hoped for, but also that it is the elenchos of things not seen. Elenchos is the Greek word for proof or evidence, the kind of demonstration that convinces a court. It is the argument that leads to a verdict. A lawyer in the ancient world would present an elenchos to show that the facts of the case pointed to a conclusion the jury could not reject. The word carries the sense of a demonstration so clear that it leaves no reasonable doubt. And the author says that faith serves the same function for things that cannot be seen. It does not make the unseen visible. It makes the unseen credible. It provides the evidence that the invisible reality is actually there. The pairing is deliberate. Hypostasis is the title deed. Elenchos is the evidence that the property exists. Together they form a complete legal framework. The believer holds the document and possesses the proof. Neither depends on sight. Neither depends on feeling. Both depend on the testimony of the one who gave the document and the one who provides the evidence. And that testimony is embedded in the history the chapter recounts. The figures in the list did not have the New Testament. They did not have the incarnation. They did not have the resurrection. But they had the promise, and they had enough evidence to act on it as though it were already fulfilled. That is the elenchos. Noah built the ark because he was warned about things not yet seen. Abraham went out because he was called. Moses chose mistreatment with the people of God rather than the treasures of Egypt because he considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than all the gold in the palace. They had evidence, not the evidence of sight, but the evidence of a word that had proven itself trustworthy in smaller things first. The present-day reader often feels that this kind of faith is out of reach because it seems to require extraordinary certainty. But the author is not describing extraordinary people. He is describing ordinary people who held an extraordinary document. Look at the list again. Rahab is there. She was a prostitute in Jericho. She was not a moral exemplar. She was not a pillar of the faith. She heard what God had done for Israel. She believed it, and she acted on it by hiding the spies. That is the entire content of her faith. She had a scrap of information, and she acted on it. The author includes her in the same chapter as Abraham and Moses. That is not an accident. It is a deliberate demonstration that the document does not require a perfect resume to be valid. It requires a hand that will take it. And that is the new tension that the chapter forces the reader to face. The list includes people who succeeded and people who failed. It includes Abraham, who lied about his wife, and Moses, who struck the rock in anger, and Samson, whose life was a mess of compromised loyalties and broken vows. Yet they are all in the list. The author does not edit out their failures. He does not explain how their faith coexisted with their flaws. He simply names them as witnesses. The lesson is not that they were strong. The lesson is that the document was stronger. Their grip may have slipped, but the document did not tear. The signature did not fade. The ownership did not revert. Application is unavoidable here. The person reading this chapter who feels that their faith is weak, inconsistent, or full of holes is looking at the wrong thing. They are looking at their hand instead of the paper in it. The author of Hebrews does not ask whether the hand is steady. He asks whether the deed is valid. And the deed is validated not by the holder's performance, but by the guarantor's death and resurrection. Jesus is the guarantor. He is the one who signed the document with his own blood. The document does not become void when the holder sins. It becomes void only if the guarantor dies without the authority to make good. But the guarantor is the one who conquered death. He cannot die again. The deed is permanent. The chapter moves toward a climax that is often missed because it is so compressed. After the long list of names and their acts of faith, the author shifts tone in verse 32. He stops naming individuals and begins speaking in a rush of participles who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. The rhythm accelerates. The victories pile up, and then without warning, the sentence turns. Women received back their dead by resurrection. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, sawn in two, killed with the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated, of whom the world was not worthy. The same faith produced both outcomes. The same document that led some through parted seas led others through flames. The author does not distinguish between the two. He does not say that those who escaped had more faith than those who died. He says that all of them were commended through their faith, and none of them received what was promised. The victories and the martyrdoms are the same chapter. They are not opposites. They are parallel demonstrations of the same principle. The document holds no matter what the visible outcome looks like. The person who walks out of the fiery furnace holds the same deed as the person who burns in it. That is the heaviest truth in the chapter, and it is the hardest one to receive. The modern reader wants faith to guarantee a certain kind of ending, but the text promises no such thing. It promises that the document is valid. It promises that the city is prepared. It promises that God is not ashamed to be called the God of those who wait. But it does not promise that the waiting will be short or that the waiting will be comfortable. The entire argument of the chapter is that the waiting is the point. It is the waiting that proves the document is real. If the promise were fulfilled immediately, it would not require a title deed. It would require only sight. But faith is the substance of things hoped for, because the thing hoped for is not yet handed over. The possession is deferred so that the trust can be exercised. The person reading this chapter has to make a choice. They can read the list of heroes as a catalog of extraordinary achievements that they can never match, or they can read it as a gallery of ordinary people who held the same document they hold. The difference is not in the quality of the faith. The difference is in the visibility of the outcome. Some of them saw victories, others saw ashes. Both held the same paper. And the author ends the chapter with a statement that reorients everything. All these, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. The word for perfect here is teleu, and it means to bring to completion, to reach the intended goal. The Old Testament saints were not made complete in isolation. Their completion was tied to the completion of the New Testament saints. The promise was always designed to be fulfilled together. The document that Abel held and the document that the reader holds are the same document. The signature is the same. The guarantor is the same. The city is the same, and no one enters it alone. The chapter that began with a legal definition ends with a corporate reality. Faith is not a solitary possession. It is a shared deed. The whole family holds it, and the whole family will enter the city together. The deed does not require your signature to be valid. It requires the signature of the one who bought the property, and he signed it when he rose from the dead. You are not the owner. You are the heir, and an heir does not purchase. An heir receives.